Alright, what's going on everybody? So over the past couple of weeks, I decided to give a certain magical index another shot, since the pandemic has slowed down the release of the Railgun English dub by at least a week or two. I've decided to wait until after Railgun season ends before I start watching the Dream Ranker arc and begin working on the Dahasai Festival arc review. Today I'll share with you guys my thoughts on the entire anime after completing all 3 seasons of Index. I also watched the 2013 movie, The Miracle of Endymion, but I might cover that in another video in the future. Given the fact that I binge watched all 74 episodes and the movie within the span of such a short period of time, I haven't had a lot of time to fully unpack and process everything yet. However, I really wanted to do a video sharing my opinion on the show after my first complete initial viewing, especially since I didn't get to put out a review for last month. I plan on rewatching the series again and reviewing each arc separately, in much the same way I've been doing for Railgun, so my thoughts are subject to change. I'll try to keep this review relatively spoiler free, but I'll speak freely and more in depth on stuff in future reviews. With that being said, let me explain what a certain magical index is for the uninitiated, and give a brief summary of the plot before sharing my thoughts on the show as a whole. A Certain Magical Index is an anime adaptation of a light novel and manga series by Kazuma Kamachi. This show, along with its 2 spin-off adaptations, A Certain Scientific Railgun and A Certain Scientific Accelerator, were all animated by JC Staff, the studio that worked on One Punch Man Season 2. A Certain Magical Index's story takes place in a world where magic and psychic abilities exist. At the forefront of scientific and technological advancements is Academy City, where student experts with psychic abilities make up around 80% of its population. The show centers mostly on a high school student named Toma Kamijo and his life in Academy City after meeting and befriending a mysterious nun named Index. Index has memorized over 100,000 magical grimoires that are usually very dangerous as they can poison a person's mind. Not soon after meeting Index, Toma finds himself in the middle of conflicts from both the magical and scientific parts of society. While Toma uses the mysterious Imagine Breaker in his right hand to protect and save others, a power struggle between both sides slowly starts to form. Each season of Index covers multiple story arcs, which can span from at least 2 to 3 episodes or at the most 5 to 6 episodes. Each season tries to cram a lot within its 24 episode run instead of focusing only on a couple of story arcs per season like the Railgun spinoff does. I think this approach is more detrimental than beneficial to the show overall. On the positive side, the fact that Index tackles many story arcs within a season allows for more variety in terms of the type of stories being told and the characters that play a role in it. There also seems to be way more action in Index in comparison to Railgun, which one could argue is because the stories are told in a shorter amount of time. This would mean that there is less build up to conflicts and the inevitable climax of an arc. Naturally, more ground is covered during each season since characters, concepts, and new subplots are introduced at a much quicker rate. However, since only a handful of episodes are dedicated to a single arc, this often results in certain arcs feeling rushed or even shortchanged. I haven't read the light novels or the manga yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if the show skipped a lot of content from the source material. Index doesn't have enough time to flesh out characters like Mizuka properly, expand on its subplots, or fully explore its themes and ideas. I think JC staff spread themselves too thin trying to cover 6 arcs per season. It might have been better if they tackled only a couple per season like what they've been doing for Railgun, or at the most 3. 3 arcs per season would have given them 8 episodes to work with per story arc, which to be honest might not have been enough depending on the amount of material that needs adapting. The Sisters, Tree Diagram Remnant, and British Royal Family arcs could have been much better had more time been devoted to these stories. The Tree Diagram Remnant arc definitely had potential, and I was surprised and disappointed by how short it was. The British Royal Family arc felt rushed, with the members of New Light and the main villain being underdeveloped. The Sisters arc in Index is nowhere near as good as it was in the Railgun spin-off series. If you watch this story play out in both series side by side, you'll see just how inferior Index's adaptation of this arc really is. While most events are largely the same, some things happen somewhat differently in terms of dialogue and certain minute actions. There's even a slight difference in tone during one scene where the Mizuka clones, referred to as sisters, reveal themselves to Toma in the alley. The tone of the scene seemed a lot more sinister and terrifying in this show than in Railgun, which was one difference that I appreciated. However, there's a lot of important complementary content missing from this version of the Sisters arc. Mizuka's guilt over her clone's horrific situation and the effect it's having on her mentally and physically isn't conveyed or elaborated on as well as it was in Railgun. Her fights against the underground organization known as Item are excluded, as well as key characters like Nunataba Shinobu, who played a supervisory role in the Sisters project. There's also more information related to the experiment that isn't mentioned in Index. Railgun took 15 episodes to tell this story, whereas Index only dedicates 5 episodes. The spin-off uses that additional time wisely to show Mizuka's desperate struggle to shut down the experiments and focus more on the psychology of the character. The best analogy I can give is that Index's version of the Sisters arc is like walking in on the last hour of Avengers Endgame. What is there is good, but without seeing the other 2 hours, you're still missing out on a lot of great moments in story context. This version of the Sisters storyline feels like such a small chunk of the overall story, with some of the emotional weight missing. One major issue aside from all the missing content is Mizuka's character at this point within the confines of the Index series. I'll be blunt, Mikoto Mizuka is a terrible character during the first half of A Certain Magical Index. The way that she is portrayed at the beginning of the series makes it hard to sympathize and feel invested in the character. Mikoto's characterization seems way off at the start of Index. She comes off as a self-absorbed, annoying jerk toward Toma, who is nothing but friendly toward her. Her attitude is way off, particularly in a couple of scenes in episode 10, in which she comes across as arrogant, smug, and condescending. The Mizuka from this series seems to be noticeably different from the one depicted in the spin-off. Perhaps it's because I came back into this series after watching several seasons of Railgun, but I really think that they butchered her character during the first half of Index. One could argue that this is because the story is primarily being told from Toma's perspective as opposed to Mizuka's, like it was in Railgun, so the character comes off as extremely hostile and unrelatable. We don't get enough time with Mizuka like we do with Toma in the beginning, so when Mizuka shows up attacking him on a daily basis after he's had an entire week of bad luck, it's hard to really care about the character. Thankfully, the character does get better going into the second season and seems a bit closer to the version of the character that I'm familiar with and love. A Certain Magical Index starts out rough, but gets better starting from the 3 Stories arc. The first 2 storylines, the Index and Deep Blood arcs, are by far the worst in my opinion. If you've seen my review for the first arc of Railgun, then you already know that I dropped this show before after watching 8 episodes because of how boring and bland it was. While my opinion on these 2 arcs haven't changed, as some of you have probably already noticed, my thoughts on Makoto in this series has definitely changed after watching Railgun. The Index arc is very dialogue heavy, and I'd argue the slowest storyline in the series. The first episode had to establish a few characters, their world, and a bit of lore, so the fact that there was a lot of talking is understandable. That being said, episode 4 almost put me to sleep because of all the excessive talking. To make matters worse, I don't really care much for Index as a character, which is a problem because she is the main focus of this particular story and is at the heart of the Deep Blood arc too. Throughout the series, Index mostly just whines about being hungry or bored and bites Toma whenever she's mad at him. The character was really annoying to me at first, and to be honest, she's really not that interesting. Index is mostly a comedy relief and damsel in distress character up until the last 2 episodes of the Kazakuri Hyoka arc, in which she starts to be more active in conflicts involving magic. From that point on, she's able to defend herself a bit more and take on more of a supporting role when the action starts if necessary. Kamachi uses the common big eater trope repeatedly with this character for comedy relief, which should endure you to the character, but it just doesn't work for me. The bottomless pit character has been done to death in plenty of shows, but this is the first time where it kind of bothered me a little. Index just comes across as very inconsiderate and selfish, as sometimes she seems more concerned with filling her belly than whatever Toma has to deal with at any given moment. I get that the character is meant to be clueless when it comes to how things work in Academy City and how certain things work in society outside the church overall, but it just seems like she gives Toma way too much grief over every little thing. The way Index is written makes it hard to care about the first arc, which is all about saving her life. The Deep Blood arc is shorter than the first arc and not as bad, but has similar problems. In this story, Toma and Style are sent to a school in Academy City to retrieve a student named Himigami Isa, who has an ability called Deep Blood, which allows her to attract vampires. In retrospect, the new character Isa was a pointless addition to Index's story. It is my understanding that Kamachi purposely created her as a forgettable tertiary character with a tragic backstory and circumstance. By design, this character is only relevant during this arc and briefly in the Kazakiri Hyoka arc. She probably could have been removed from the series and nothing would have been lost. While I didn't hate this character, much like Index, I didn't care about her either. We only get a little of her backstory, so maybe if we got more of that and the character was fleshed out more, then I could have cared. Like I said before, I understand the author's intentions, but this is the sort of thing I've criticized another series for doing before with a character, so I can't give Kamachi a pass here. Not only is Isa underwritten, but the whole vampire thing becomes irrelevant after the story arc is over. The Deep Blood arc introduces several new elements such as the existence of vampires and the idea of alchemists with the central villain, Aureolus Izzard. The idea of vampires existing was one of the only things that I can think of in the entire series that was pointless and never addressed again. Now, before anyone tries to argue with me, yes, alchemy is never used again outside this arc, but it fits into the lore since it's still a form of magic. It's still a sub-form of magic. In general, when the show introduces new concepts or starts world building, what is presented is usually important and it's referred to again. Unless I'm forgetting something, they never mention or explore the existence of vampires after this story arc. A Certain Magical Index does plenty of world and lore building throughout the series, but is not handled as well as the Railgun spin-off. In my opinion, the Railgun series does a better job explaining new concepts, especially any stuff dealing with the science side of things. This would include stuff such as the AIM diffusion field that espers constantly emit, or the concept of personal reality. The delivery of new information to the audience is more digestible thanks to the occasional accompanying visuals, examples given by characters involved in a particular scene, and streamlined dialogue. Index's dialogue tends to be very wordy, whereas Railgun's dialogue is more concise and to the point. Most of the magic side elements introduced at the beginning of the series failed to intrigue me, and that's partially due to how it's presented to the audience. Aside from the beginning of the Angel Fall arc, the magical abilities didn't start to interest or entertain me until the second season. In my opinion, the best content from the series comes either from the science side or when both the magical and scientific sides collide. Out of Index's 13 story arcs, the Document of Constantine, Dragon, Battle Royale, Academy City Invasion, 3 Stories, Kazakiri Hyoka, and World War III arcs were the highlight of the show for me. Out of these 7 arcs, the World War III storyline was probably the weakest as the animation and pacing took a hit in Season 3, and it's a bit messy Season 3. As I mentioned earlier, the show gets better going into the second season, especially during the 3 Stories arc. During this particular storyline, the focus is split between Toma and a powerful level 5 Esper named Accelerator. This storyline is the first time where the role of main protagonist starts to get blurred between Toma and another character. The series tends to switch focus between Toma and other characters such as Accelerator or a powerless Esper named Hamazora. Toma isn't even a part of the Battle Royale arc, but instead Accelerator and Hamazora take the lead. I really like that this show is willing to put the spotlight on characters other than its primary protagonist Toma. This not only helps to keep things interesting and varied in terms of characters and conflicts, but also alleviates the repetition that would no doubt come from how a lot of the conflicts are resolved by Toma. With a couple of exceptions, all villains are taken down the same way when Toma is involved. He gives a speech explaining why their outlook on life or actions they took were wrong, and then punches them with the Magic Breaker to incapacitate them. Then, the next time we see the villain, their viewpoint has changed and they have seen the error of their ways. They basically become one of the good guys or have been reformed in some way by Toma's words. This is something that doesn't happen every single time a villain is defeated, but it occurred enough that I noticed it. If the show focused mostly on Toma, then the resolutions to each big battle would have grown formulaic and stale. A Certain Magical Index manages to stay fresh and exciting after the 3 Stories arc, thanks to its revolving door of protagonists and other great characters that were introduced later on. While I initially didn't care about Toma when I first watched this show, I've grown fonder of the character after watching the Railgun spin-off series and finishing this series. I eventually started to like Toma a lot more as a somewhat sympathetic, altruistic, and courageous hero the more I saw of him. He's definitely not the most compelling character in the show, but I did find the mystery surrounding a Magic Breaker interesting after a while. Accelerator is hands down the best written character and is easily one of my favorites from the science side of the Index universe. His ascension from villain to anti-hero was excellently executed and riveting. Accelerator's character development comes steadily, and his transition from antagonist to protagonist seems like a natural progression for the character. I really like his interactions and relationship with the law enforcement officer named Yumikawa and the younger Mizuka clone Last Order. Another character I really enjoyed from the science side is Hamazora. Hamazora was one of the many characters from the Academy City's criminal underworld that I got attached to due to his personality and motivation. I can't really speak much on the character without getting into spoilers, but all I'll say is that this guy is really lucky. There are times where he'll be in a very dire situation and he'll find his way out by chance or sometimes by quick thinking. The character is very tenacious, and despite him getting mixed up in criminal activity, there still seems to be some capacity to do good in him. Hamazora simply made poor life choices. Let's just keep it at that. In terms of the magic side characters that stood out to me, there wasn't really a lot. The two magicians introduced in the Index arc named Style and Kanzaki were just okay. I honestly didn't care too much about them. The same could be said for Toma's high school friend Motoharu, who I found irritating most of the time unless he's being serious. My favorite character from the magic side was a magician named Isawa, who was introduced early on in season 2. I'm sure I said this countless times on my channel before, but I'm generally not a fan of female characters that are shy, timid, frail, and outspoken. I've never been a fan of female characters that have that combination of personality traits, especially if the character is utterly useless most of the time. The best example of what I'm talking about is Hinata from Naruto. That being said, Itsuwa starts out shy when it comes to trying to approach Toma, as she has developed feelings for him. However, at the start of season 3, the character takes on a more active role as support for Toma, and this is where the character started to come out of her shell a bit more. More of her personality started to surface as she tried to protect Toma from a certain threat. Itsuwa is friendly and kind-hearted, but also very skilled in and outside of combat. The character really grew on me, and her fight in the Aqua at the back arc was a good display of how formidable she can be when she's determined and focused. The fights in the certain magical index are subpar until after the first 2 arcs. Beyond that point in the series, however, there are a lot of great fights that stay entertaining due to the different magical and esper abilities being used by each character. Fights involving Toma are at their best when he can't simply punch his way through the magic or esper ability and must use his head to find the best way to defeat his opponent. Accelerator and Hamazora also have some really entertaining battles. One of Hamazora's fights against a certain character was so satisfying to watch, given that person's actions and attitude towards certain people. Accelerator's fights are typically very brutal and bloody, and for a while he takes pleasure in hurting and killing his enemies. In general, this series was a lot darker and bloodier than I initially thought it was going to be. For example, there was a scene where a group of people stabbed themselves in the air. In another scene earlier in the series, a person's flesh got ripped off their body. These were just a couple of examples of moments that got my attention, especially the flesh ripping part, which occurred during the second arc. That was probably one of the most memorable moments of that otherwise mediocre story arc. There is one other thing, but I'm not going to say exactly what it is because it's kind of a spoiler. Anyway, Index is not only more bloody and brutal in comparison to Railgun, but it also contains way more fan service. Railgun really doesn't have much fan service in it, despite being a series where the large majority of its cast are girls. The few moments of fan service in that series didn't occur until recently in season 3, and it's not too distracting. Index, on the other hand, has a plethora of fan service scenes, and they usually involve Toma accidentally walking in on a girl undressing or bathing. Toma might fall, landing conveniently between a girl's legs, or he'll accidentally script someone using a Magic Breaker. I swear, one of Toma's classmates, Big Boobs, Siri Fukiyose, exists only for the sole purpose of fan service. The amount of fan service in this show might annoy some people, but it never got in the way of the stories being told or felt out of place. In fact, Toma's bad luck due to his Imagine Breaker is why some of these fan service scenes occur, which usually end with Toma getting hit by the girl or bitten if Index is involved. There were at least a couple of times where they went a bit overboard with the fan service, but it never got to the point where it started to ruin my enjoyment of the show. There was even a particular scene that I actually appreciated simply because of how the characters involved handled the situation, as opposed to how most of these moments usually end. Before I close out this review, I want to speak briefly on the show's presentation. A Certain Magical Index isn't as visually impressive as its other 2 spin-offs. The first season generally doesn't look as good as the other seasons, which should be expected as it's the oldest batch of episodes. However, some of the art and animation in the third season of Index looks way worse than the first season. I'm no expert when it comes to animation, but even I noticed how rough some of the animation and art looked in season 3. In one scene during the British royal family arc, several frames of animation were reused and it didn't look fluid at all. The show really looks its best during the opening and ending sequences, which have some really good songs accompanying the visuals. In general, none of the background music really stood out aside from the tracks that I've already heard from the Railgun spin-off. On the other hand, the voice acting was good, which is to be expected since the voice cast includes a lot of notable talent such as Austin Tyndall, Monica Rao, Micah Solisod, Brittany Karbowski, Christopher Sabat, Clifford Chapman, and many others. It was very nice hearing certain actors portray characters that are different from what they're known for, such as Clifford Chapman voicing Hamazora or Bryn April voicing Masujime. Overall, A Certain Magical Index is a solid science fantasy action series that doesn't quite live up to its potential. It starts out rough, constantly drowning the viewer in dialogue and introducing characters that may be hard to become invested in. While the show improves visually over time, the beginning does show its age a bit, and the final season's animation wasn't up to par in certain scenes. Its biggest issue is its cramped seasons that attempt to tell some possibly fantastic stories within a short amount of time. As a result, certain characters are weaker than they should be and certain arcs feel rushed. Nevertheless, after the first 4 arcs, the series improves tremendously by telling more engaging stories featuring multiple protagonists and further expanding its world with fascinating lore and characters. Besides that, the voice acting is top notch and there are some really entertaining fights that make use of some unique abilities and weapons. I'm glad I decided to give this show a second chance after getting into the Railgun spinoff, and I can't wait to watch the Accelerator spinoff. Hopefully it's on the same level of quality as the other spinoff and not this show. Despite its flaws, I definitely recommend this series to fans of shonen action shows. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this review, and if you did, please hit the like button. Thank you guys for watching. I'm out of here. Peace.